In Print Radio. In Print is a professional writers organization located in Rockford, Illinois. We're dedicated to providing resources and education off the page and on the air. Hello, I'm Bob Francis. Today, In Print member Louise Brass sits down with historical fiction writer Wayne Turmel.
I'm sitting here today with Wayne Turmel, author of Count of the Sahara. How did you come to write The Count of the Sahara? It's based on the real-life Indiana Jones, I understand.
Well, see, you've been reading Wikipedia. If you look Count Byron de Prorock up on Wikipedia, it implies that the character of Indiana Jones was based on him. I think it was based on what he viewed himself to be, because he wrote a number of books in the 20s and 30s where he was this swashbuckling archaeologist going through, and the truth wasn't nearly that glamorous, but he was a real archaeologist, amateur archaeologist in the 1920s and 30s. He was young, he was handsome, he was charismatic, he had a title, and the press adored him. And so they kind of built him up as this larger-than-life character, and as real life has a tendency to do, caught up with him. And his end was not nearly as glamorous as his beginning, but yeah, Byron de Prorock was a real person, and the book is based on an expedition that he went on that was underwritten by Beloit College and the New York Times, of all things, in 1925. And then the lecture tour that he went on immediately afterwards through the Midwest in 1926, where basically everything fell to pieces. So that's the book. And Byron is a fascinating character, and if you aren't Googling him while you're listening to this, you should.
Well, this book has been called the historical fiction at its best. And maybe it's at its best because you're based on a lot of fact of this fellow, but then there's also, your imagination built into it. So did you travel very much to write The Count of the Sahara?
I traveled all the way from Chicago to Beloit. was as far as it got. I've always been an armchair traveler, so food and reading have always been the way I've been able to get my travel fix. And with this particular story, because Beloit College and the Logan Museum had underwritten the expedition, the archives of the trip were sitting in Beloit. And so when I started to do the research, my contact, the guy who is kind of the renowned expert on Byron, a guy named Michael Tarabolsky, said, well, just call Beloit College and ask to see the archives. And I said, well, who am I? I'm some guy. I'm not an academic. He said, trust me. So I called and said, I'm writing a novel, and it's based on Byron de Prorock, and I'd like to see the archives. And she said, can you be here Thursday? And so Beloit College, blessings upon them, opened the doors and opened their archives and let me roll around in them.
And did you find some surprising things about your character?
I found wonderful things in there. The key thing was that he was a little bit of a charlatan, and it took everybody a while to catch on. And so if you read the correspondence in the archives, at the beginning, it's very gushy, and there's a bromance going on, and my dearest Byron, blah, blah, blah. And by the time they were done in 1926, it was Dear Sir. And you could see the relationship falling apart, and you could see that all of the challenges were having a toll on everybody. And in fact, things got so bad, and the good stuff happened after the book was finished, actually, but things got so messed up in Algeria that in order for the Logan Museum folks to get out with their artifacts, the president of the college actually had to contact President Calvin Coolidge to sort things out with the Algerian government. I mean, when Byron screwed up, he screwed up good. And so just the things you found in there were just fascinating. And then little details.
Well, it's the little details that make a good book, I think, or even a movie. Of course, Indiana Jones was very fond of wearing his fedora, and you're wearing a fedora today, I think. Is that...
It's actually not a tribute other than I'm finally old enough that if I want to wear hats, I'll jolly well wear hats, and nobody can tell me not to. When you reach a certain age or a certain income level, you're eccentric. And you need to be either a certain age or a certain income level. Underneath that, you're just annoying and pretentious.
Your book is based in the 1925, I believe, was mostly. And is that an era that you're very interested in?
It's a fascinating era for me for a number of reasons. The expedition and the book alternates between the lecture tour in the winter of 1926 and the fall of 1925 when they did the expedition to Algeria. But the 20s is such an amazing time period. If you think about what was going on, it was the beginning of media culture, for example. So Byron was one of the first to use film, and he did aerial photography and underwater photography, and that's what made his stage shows and his lectures so compelling, because people had literally never seen that before. The movies had kind of made archaeology a glamorous profession. Howard Carter had just found Tut a few years before, and all of that was captured on film. And so people had it, and Hollywood was having the dashing archaeologist, fighting mummies and uncovering tombs and doing all of that. And Byron was tall and good looking and young and incredibly charismatic on stage. And so I always said he'd have made a great Kardashian, because he was a shameless self-promoter, and he really grabbed the public at a time when we were just developing this media culture. The wire services, a little newspaper in Zanesville, Ohio, could pick up the story that was in the New York Times, whereas that wasn't possible a few years before. And we think about what was going on in music and art and film and all of those things happening in the 20s. It makes for a great story.
His name was Count Byron de Prorock. How did he get? Is that a real title? Was it given to him, or did he earn it?
Was it a real title? Well, when his wife, the socialite Alice Kenny, married him, it was real. And when they had the marriage annulled several years later, it was fake. So these things are in the eye of the beholder. Near as we can tell, what happened is that Byron's parents separated when he was very young, and his mother took him to Europe, and her brother was an uncle, and he had a Polish title, which after the First World War, of course, wasn't worth the money it was printed on, but it was legitimate. And since the uncle adopted Byron, technically he could use the title, but it didn't amount to a hill of beans.
What were they looking for in this expedition? I know they tangled with tribesmen and all kinds of things, but...
It's funny, the expedition itself wasn't much. What happened was there was an expedition going out, and as with all these things, you need multiple investors, right? So Logan Museum and Beloit College was doing anthropological research on the Tuareg tribes, and going all the way back to the Neolithic period, trying who had lived in the Algerian Sahara and why would they live there and what was their life like. And it was basic anthropology. But then the New York Times got involved, and Renault wanted to show off these fancy cars that they built specifically for the desert. And so they got Byron. And then, of course, Byron decided they needed to search for treasure. So they decided to look for the tomb of Queen Tin Hinan, who was a Berber queen, real or mythical, nobody was really sure, who was considered the mother of the Tuareg people. And everybody kind of knew where the tomb was supposed to be, but of course, was there a tomb there? Was there treasure? Who knew? So they took a long, winding route, doing all the anthropological work for the Logan, but all the time Byron was really focused on getting his mitts on Queen Tin Hinan's tomb. And they did find a tomb, and it contained very little treasure, although part of the problem is Byron raved, and the New York Times reported that this was the greatest treasure find since Tut. And so, of course, when they went to leave, the Algerian government went, "Where's the treasure?" And at this point, Byron couldn't admit there wasn't any. So the theory was that he had stolen all of this treasure and had raided the tomb and done all this stuff. In fact, they had found very little. And in double fact, there's no guarantee they even found the Queen's tomb, because there was considerable evidence, and people who were on the trip said, "I think it was the body of a teenage boy." And so...
Sort of like a King Tut of the...
Well... What had happened was everybody was so invested in it being Tin Hinan, the New York Times had reported that it was. Byron had staked his reputation on it. The Algerian government had announced it, and they couldn't possibly admit that it was a fraud. And so, there was all kinds of things like the pelvis was very slim. Too slim for a modern woman. And so, Byron's explanation was, well, we know that Tin Hinan had no children. Obviously, her pelvis was misshapen, and that's why she never had children. And we found a fertility totem inside the tomb. So obviously, they had buried her in the hopes that in the next life she would have children. And Alonzo Pond, who was on the tour, went, no, it's a 14-year-old boy. And so nothing is really settled, and that, of course, is part of the fascinating mystery.
And we'll be back in a few moments with Wayne Turmel. And we're back. Now, Alonzo Pond, was he from the Logan Museum at Beloit College?
Alonzo Pond was from Janesville, Wisconsin, and he was a graduate student at Beloit. He had actually had a fairly interesting life and was a very interesting guy on his own. And part of his great frustration was that he never achieved the kind of level of success that he expected. He was one of these guys who always did good work, always kept his nose clean, always did what was expected of him, and never quite got the reward. And that continued his entire life. He's a fascinating character on his own, but the tension in the expedition sections of the book really stems from Pond, who's this hardworking, honest, ethical person who's just struggling to make his bones, and Byron, who's fly-by-night and flies by the seat of his pants and lies pathologically and seems to be getting all the rewards. And so the human tension between those two was very real. But it's funny, in the archives, we found letters from Pond saying, yeah, Byron was a liar and you can't believe half of what he says, but, I really kind of like him. So that tension was always there.
Is that what helped you build this story?
Yeah, there was a moment when, and anybody who's done research into fiction, you have that moment where the story makes sense. And for me, I was reading some of the letters from Pond. This was a young graduate student. He was struggling to get through school, and he had visions of taking his findings from the expedition and going on a lecture tour, maybe making as much as $100 a night, which in 1926 was pretty good cash. And he wrote a letter to his boss at the Logan Museum, George Colley, and said, this is great stuff, and I can go on this lecture tour and maybe even make $100. And Colley wrote him back and said, yeah, that's great, but as soon as you're done here, we're sending you to a dig in Poland. And so I could just imagine, he's in the Algerian desert and he's putting up with all this craziness. And then he reads this letter and his dream of making a little cash is postponed yet again. While Byron was going out and making $250 a night on these lecture tours, you can imagine the tension, the resentment, how that would bubble up. And so when I read that, the analogy that came to me was, it was Amadeus. It was Amadeus in the desert. Pond was the Salieri character, and Byron was the Mozart character. Now, that's gross exaggerations all the way around, but once I had that dynamic, it was so clear what the relationship would have been in the desert, and so it all came together for me there.
It sounds like newspapers are a real great source for your researching.
Newspapers are wonderful. And of course, back in the day, of course, you had to go to the newspaper and you went through the microfiche, I'm dating myself, or you went through the giant books of back issues. And now there's a couple of resources. Newspapers.com is wonderful for writers who are looking for those little period details. For example, Byron and Willie stayed in Rockford overnight in one of the chapters. And so I went to newspapers.com in January 1926, hotels. And up popped a number of stories that were set at the Chick Hotel, or the Chick House Hotel in downtown Rockford. So I thought, okay, so I did a little more research, and yep, that's exactly where they would have stayed. So have them staying at the Chick House Hotel. So that's newspapers.com. The other thing that was, for this story in particular, very helpful, if you subscribe to the New York Times Online, which is crazy cheap, you could subscribe to what's called the Times Machine. They have digitized all of their past issues all the way back to the 1890s. And so the expedition, which was partly underwritten by the Times, so was on the front page, I have every newspaper article written about the expedition and what actually showed up in the Times. You know, it's a golden age for those of us who are trying to do research. It's never been better or easier.
And what other towns in the Midwest does your book deal with?
We open up in Grinnell, Iowa. So they left Grinnell and they went to Moline. Real important stuff happens in Moline. And then Milwaukee and Chicago. And then they leave Chicago. They go to Rockford, Madison, and then Beloit. And then the climax occurs back in Chicago.
You yourself have traveled quite a bit. You were born in Canada, in Mission, British Columbia?
Mission, BC. Mm-hmm. I am the second most famous person to ever come from Mission, BC. The only other person that anybody has ever heard of is Carly Rae Jepsen, the singer. Who did Call Me Maybe. She apparently, and she was years after me, was also a graduate of Mission Senior Secondary, Go Roadrunners. And then I moved to Toronto, and then I moved to Los Angeles, and then we moved to the Midwest in 2001.
And you spent some time in Los Angeles, I believe?
I did. I was in my misbegotten past. I was in show business. I was a stand-up comic, and I was working in Canada and getting some plankton level of acceptance, and so I moved to LA to be a big star, and then the bottom fell out of the comedy business, and you can see how well that whole being a big star thing worked.
But you did appear on Evening at the Improv, I believe, and
yeah.
Chicago and Hall & Oates, and a few of those.
Yeah, I opened for Chicago at Agra Center in Regina or Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. I opened for Chicago, and I opened for Hall & Oates in Edmonton. I had a good run as a stand-up, but that's a young man's game. And it was, you know, the late 80s, very early 90s, there was a real boom on in comedy clubs. So I toured Canada, and I toured through the Midwest, and then the bottom fell out of the business, and there I was in LA with a wife and child and a stack of bills. And so
you ran away from the circus.
I ran away from the circus and got a real big boy job, and that's what's brought me to this point.
And that led you into writing some nonfiction books, business books. So you've done about 7 in the last 11 years.
Yeah, I was shocked when I actually updated my Amazon page for Count of the Sahara, because I've always written, I was writing magazine articles, and I've contributed chapters to books. And my first book that I wrote came out in 2003, was called A Philistine's Journal, An Average Guy Tackles the Classics. That was basically a book of humorous essays. But then I did a number of things related to my consulting business, communication skills, how to do good webinars, that kind of thing, and have cranked out several books in that field. And then last year, Count of the Sahara came out, and that's my first fiction book. So now I'm a real writer.
You are also president of GreatWebMeetings.com.
Yeah, it's a consulting company. I've taught presentation skills for over 20 years, but now that a lot of us are doing webinars, we're using WebEx and Skype and various things, there's a different set of presentation skills that are required. And so what GreatWebMeetings.com does is we teach those virtual presentation and communication skills, how to run good meetings, how to manage your team when everybody's scattered hither and yon. GreatWebMeetings.com. Check it out. That's how I make my living, and that frees me up to do things like write books.
Well, what really inspired you, other than the storyline, of course, which is very fascinating, but what made you move into the fiction world?
It was a bucket list item for me. I always felt, even though I've written my entire adult life and with some degree of success, I never really, real writers write novels. It's kind of the romantic kid in me. That's real writing. And so I always wanted to write a novel, and I decided to check something off my bucket list. And then when I found the story of Byron de Prorock, and I don't know what I was thinking, because it's a very complicated book for a first time out. Got shifting time periods, and you've got realistic things that need to be adhered to, and it's 300 pages and pretty hefty chunk for somebody's first effort at it. But the story was fun, and I just told myself, that's it, I'm going to do it. And so I got a book that showed you how to write a novel in 90 days, and by golly, by day 87, the first draft was done. So
it took you only about a year then?
You know, the new world of publishing is so insane to those of us that grew up with an old model, you know, where you had to get an agent and then the publisher, and then it would take a year and a half to get the book out. From sitting down to the blank page to holding the book in my hand was just under a year. And when you consider that you write the first draft and then you get feedback, and you write the second draft and then you have to find a publisher, and then the publisher is actually in the UK. And yet, because things can be done digitally, because things can be done so quickly, because of the way Amazon works with Kindle and the way that they print, it could be done so quickly. It was stunning to me. And it's funny, somebody in imprint was talking to me about how they're working through a self-publishing company and everything went quiet for 7 weeks and they were terrified that something horrible had happened. 7 weeks is incredibly fast. It's unbelievably fast if you think about how complicated putting a good product out is. And yet we've gotten used to this online world where everything happens so quickly. So I was trying to listen empathetically as she was complaining about the 7-week gap. But I was going, you know that that's a miracle, right? You know that that's nothing. And I can relate, because when I handed my last changes over to my publisher, Eric, and I said, here you go. And then I was waiting and waiting and waiting, and time is relative, right? Einstein said, a second with your hand on a hot stove feels like forever, an hour with a pretty girl feels like a second. So the fact that it took actually very little time to take those finished products, put a title on it, format it, and get it up on Kindle felt like forever to me on this end. So...
Now, how did you find the book folks that actually published your book?
You know, without the internet, life itself would be impossible. I was doing the kind of standard find an agent, send query, get rejected, move on to the next agent. And I was starting to run out of patience. And so I just Googled something really complex like publishers that take unsolicited manuscripts. I mean, something really obvious. And came up with a list of 20 or so publishers, and then go on their website and see what kind of stuff they publish and how do they do it. And the book folks, which was actually under another title at the time, but now it's thebookfolks.com, looked like they might kind of sort of be interested. And so I sent them a query, and 2 weeks later I had a contract in my hand.
Yes, that's pretty quick. How did you come up with the title, or is that your original title?
I didn't come up with the title. I will tell anybody who will listen that one of the advantages of having a publisher that is not yourself, I am not prejudiced against people who self-publish. I just believe that people who understand the business can give you insight that other people can't. So the original title was incredibly artsy and pretentious. I believe the original title was Pith Helmets in the Snow. Doesn't that sound like something you want to run out and buy? And Eric, in his very British way, said, no. And so we had to play with it, and I lost the fight over the title, and he was right. The Count of the Sahara is an infinitely better title. And then we were designing the cover, and I told him what I thought the cover should look like, and he went, no. And he was right. So the beautiful thing about finding a publisher that you share a vision with is they can push back and they can make the product better, which is their job. And especially with a traditional publisher model where they're taking the financial risk. With a small publisher like that, you don't get an advance, but you're not paying for design cover, and they're paying for the formatting, and they're paying for the marketing and all of that. And so it just makes so much sense to let the professionals do what they do.
What do you like to read when you're not actually writing?
I am like a raccoon. I'm omnivorous. I love history, obviously. That's kind of my first love, so history and biography. But when I read fiction, I'm all over the place. Primarily historical fiction, I guess. But when I'm just in the mood for jelly beans, I read a lot of like sword and sorcery stuff. You know, it really, whatever comes across my way, I can enjoy.
And we'll be back in a moment. We're back with Wayne Turmel, author of Count of the Sahara. Do you have a favorite fiction book?
Favorite fiction book? Well, my all-time favorite book, the one that corrupted me forever and is to blame for everything that's happened in my life, is The Three Musketeers, which I read... Well, I originally read it as a Classics Illustrated comic when I was about 11 or 12 years old. And then I read the book when I was about 14. There was a period for about 15 years where I reread it every year. It's actually been 2 or 3 years.
What was it about this book that was so endearing to you?
What was it about the book? It was a young man who felt completely unappreciated, who was from circumstances that didn't lend themselves to success, but he believed he could do it. Can't imagine why such a thing would appeal to me growing up in small-town Canada. It had adventure, it had romance. I'm a sucker for a good sword fight. Swords are so much cooler than guns. It had everything. I mean, as a story, it was terrific. Now, as historical fiction, of course, it's complete nonsense. There are things that are completely out of order. The characters, Richelieu was not what they said he was in the book. They had the wrong king, It was amazing. I mean, as a piece of history, it's ludicrous, but as an adventure story, it's really hard to top. I mean, it's got everything.
Do you think a historical novel should have, a lot of true situations presented as part of the story?
Well, I think that's what the historical part is. I mean, to me, a good historical novel teaches me something about the time or the place that I didn't know, or about the person, and drives me to learn more. I mean, so many times I've read a book and gone, I don't know enough about that, and so I'll go down the Google rabbit hole and learn more about whatever that particular time period is. I think that's the job of historical fiction, is to teach us something. So when it says something that is patently untrue, I kind of struggle with that. There are some people who are just obsessed, and everything has to be exactly right. And if there's one little factual thing, it spoils the story. Civil War buffs are like this, Chancellor's Hill was only 27 feet high. There's no way he'd have made that shot under those wind conditions. Oh, shut up. I'm not quite that obsessive. But I think that it's important that it be true enough that it has the ring of truth to it, that it sets the setting, and frankly, that the learner maybe learns a little something they didn't learn before. I think that's what makes for good historical fiction for me.
And do you research like the slang that was used at the certain period?
I think as much as you can. Obviously, prior to probably the mid-19th century, that's rather hard to do, because the only people that were writing were churchmen and the upper class, and so you very seldom got a sense of what real people were saying or doing, so you do the best you can. I mean, the book that I'm working on now is set during the Crusades. You kind of know, I mean, all the good curse words were either religious or poopy. Those were your options. Various and sundry scatological things, and anything blasphemous would probably do. So you can make some educated guesses about it. But it's hard to be accurate. And that's tough for me, because dialogue is really important to me. Getting the way people actually talk is really critical to me. I've got a decent ear, and when I read dialogue that doesn't smack true, you sense it immediately. So it doesn't need to be 100% accurate, but it needs to be true to the time and the people.
So what are your future plans for the 20th?
Well, I'm plugging the heck out of the Count of the Sahara, hoping people will go to Amazon.com and buy it in paperback or Kindle. Part of my deal with my publisher, the Book Folks, was that they got first right of refusal on the next one, so Eric is already sending me panicky emails demanding to know how we're doing. So the new book is on chapter 15 of 20. I am almost finished the first draft, and that is a story shamelessly based on Rudyard Kipling's Kim, but set during the Second Crusade. And the working title, politically incorrect, is Acra's Bastard. It's the story of a little street kid who gets caught between the Saracens and the Franks.
Is that harder to research? After all, they didn't have newspapers in those days to record everything in their archives.
It is a little bit tougher in that you don't have a track to run on. You kind of know that certain things occurred, and you know who the main characters were. But you don't get a lot of the secondary characters. We don't have a lot of the detail, and most of what we do know is nonsense, particularly about the Crusades, because, of course, it's been filtered through history, religion, politics, languages, and everything else. So we know the bare bones. We know enough about what's going on. This story is really about the common people and how they were caught in the middle of things, and there's a lot of wiggle room for the truth there because there's very little actual evidence.
What inspired you to write this book?
Swords are cooler than guns. I've always been a sucker for knights on horseback and all of that stuff. The Crusades is a wonderful time, and there's probably a 3-beer conversation to be had about how much nonsense was spouted by it and how you can trace all kinds of horrible things to it, and at the same time, people are capable of amazing acts of bravery, and amazing action happens, and individuals are capable of amazing things during wartime, and it's knights and swords and horses and stuff. Come on, who doesn't love that?
And growing up in Canada, you probably heard about King Richard the Lionheart, who went after the Crusades.
Well, absolutely, and actually this book takes place about 4 years before Richard shows up, because this is the Battle of the Horns of Hattin, where everything goes to pot. Richard came to lead the Third Crusade, and so this is prior to that. There's a chance, well, I know Eric is going to ask me to make this a series, and the series would end with Luca meeting Richard, but I'm not even prepared to do that. I need to finish the first book first.
Well, I think we'll be looking forward to that very much also. What started your passion for writing?
Oh, man. I was always a geeky kid with my nose in a book. Both my parents were voracious readers. Not terribly educated people, my parents, but always reading and always encouraging me to do that. And I remember as a kid, my grandmother had passed away, and she had the full set of Perry Mason mysteries, Earl Stanley Gardner. And so at 9, I'm working my way through all the Perry Mason books. So writing and reading were always great passions.
Is it really important for writers to read a lot and broadly?
The opinions expressed are solely those of the management. I believe it is. I really do. I know writers who only read in their genre and don't read very extensively. I think that's a mistake. I think you can always learn, if you're writing a mystery, for example. Well, as a kid, my dad and I were both big fans of Robert Ludlum, and the Russian villains were always quoting Dostoevsky or Tolstoy or whatever. Well, if you don't know who Dostoevsky and Tolstoy are, you're missing out. So I believe that you can draw from anything and you can learn. If you write hard-boiled detective fiction and you never read romance, maybe you need to learn how to write a really romantic scene between your leads, and you're not going to learn that reading Mickey Splain.
Wayne Turmel, thank you so much for speaking with me today.
Thank you for speaking to me.